All right, welcome everyone. Happy Wednesday. Middle of the week is upon us. If you came off of the US holiday weekend, hopefully you are not quite burned out on the week just yet. But welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. If this is your first Power to Fly event, or if you are a frequent flyer, we're so happy to have you here. My name is Meg. I'm part of Power to Fly's virtual hosting team, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's event with Kelsey. So before I introduce you to our amazing speaker, I'm going to real quick go over some housekeeping items, just basics on how you can participate today. So there's a couple different bubbles here that you can see, different ways that you can join in and participate in today's session. We always love to encourage our audience members to jump in and really drive the conversation. So you can participate in a couple different ways. You can, if you come off mute to ask your question or add comments or anything like that, awesome. But if you do that, you will show up on the live recording of today's event. So if you have any kind of privacy concerns, no worries, you can still participate. You are just going to type questions, comments, anything you have into the Zoom chat. And if you are in like super black ops, deep cover, no one can know you're here, that's okay. You're just going to send your questions or comments in a DM to me instead of sending them to everyone in the thread. At which point I will raise your comments or questions and I'll keep you anonymous. Like I said, today's session is being recorded. So if you are joining us and have your camera turned on, the only way that's ever going to show up on our recording or our live stream of this is if you come off mute. So to that end, I always welcome and encourage everyone to turn their cameras on, get to see some fresh faces, especially in this weird quasi-pandemic situation. It's a nice way to make sure that you're seeing people's faces, but safely. All right, so like I said, today's session is being recorded. So if you, what's going to happen is everybody that registered for today's session is going to get an email in about 1 to 2 business days, and it will have a link to where you can rewatch today's session, which is really great because that way you don't feel like you have to take notes. It doesn't matter if you, kind of don't catch what somebody says. You can always go back and review the recording. The other thing I like to highlight for people is that if Kelsey says something on today's chat that is just mind-blowing and you have to have to share it with a coworker or with your friend or with a family member, awesome. We want to do everything we can to support that. So if you don't want to wait the 1 to 2 business days till you get your rewatch link, that's okay. You can head over to our YouTube channel. Actually, I'll drop the link in the thread here in just a moment. But our YouTube channel for our dedicated Chat and Learn channel is where you can go and check out recordings from a lot of our past events. As well as the recording for this session will be live there, usually within about 5 to 15 minutes of the end of the recording session for us. So like I said, this is being recorded. You can always go back and share the recording wherever you like. One other thing I like to highlight is that you can keep up with us on various social media platforms. We're not just on YouTube. So we are at Power to Fly, all one word, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So I'm going to grab that info. Please feel free if you want to take pictures or video as we go and share with your community. Let people know that you are learning with Power to Fly today. It's a great way to spread the message about some of our amazing resources and help other people upskill in their careers or advance or learn more or whatever you are here to do today. So I always encourage that. Let's see, I think that'll be all for now, and then we'll go over a couple more things after we get our amazing speaker intro to y'all. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Kelsey Leftwich. Kelsey is a senior software developer with Headway, where she helps startups and innovation teams bring their ideas to life. She loves teaming up with subject matter experts and making magic where their domains collide. Welcome, Kelsey. We're so happy to have you today.
Thanks so much, Meg. I'm so glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this bio or any information about like why you're such an amazing person to speak on the topic of curiosity driving collaboration?
Yeah, so I feel like this topic is near and dear to my heart because I've worked in a lot of different industries, from logistics, both over the road, on the seas. I've worked in different, I've worked for lawyers, I've worked in education. I can, there's so many. I
Your
would have to pull
background
up my
sounds a
link.
lot like mine, like a lot of
I'd
different
have to pull up
industries.
my LinkedIn page to find it. But all that said, finance is one. All that said, in these varied industries, what I've discovered is that there's a real joy in like digging in and sort of, when in Rome, doing as the Romans do. And if you embrace the curiosity mindset, you'll be successful, but also I think you'll enjoy the work even that much more.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I loved the title of this chat because I'm totally late to the party, but I just got done watching Ted Lasso on Apple TV. And one of the like big things he talks about is like being curious. And if you're not curious, there's a lot that you will never learn and never know and never understand because you aren't asking questions. You're just coming in and deciding you already know what's going on in the situation. If you haven't seen it, it's adorable. Definitely watch it. But
I've heard good things. I haven't seen it yet though.
I don't know why. I just got obstinate about it and didn't do it for like months. And I had multiple friends that were like, oh, you gotta watch this. It's so great. And honestly, it's lovely. It's just one of those things. It's like, it's fun, but it's also uplifting. It's not too cheesy. It's really good. Plus Jason Sudeikis. I would watch that man read the phone book.
I can agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for that great, kind of connecting information. Obviously, I want to highlight the fact that Kelsey is here today as part of the Headway team. So I'm sharing a link into the chat thread here where you can check out Headway's company page on powertofly.com. Now, one thing to know about this page, so there's your link right there. One thing to know about this page is that you can find some pretty interesting things here. What the biggest thing obviously is most people want to know like where to look at their open roles. So you can click on that open jobs button right there. That'll show you how, the different jobs that they have open currently. The other thing you can do here, or multiple things you can do here, you can check out company info. That'll give you more information on who Headway is as a company, what they do, maybe a little bit about what their culture's like. You can also click on events. That'll show you past events that Headway team members have participated in with us, but it'll also show you upcoming events that they're set to join in on, like today's Chat and Learn. We also have our June mini summit coming up next week. We've got future Chat and Learns as well as office hours, all kinds of stuff. So definitely check that out. And then the other thing I want to highlight is at the top of this page, when you navigate there, follow that link that I put in the thread. There's going to be a big pink follow button at the upper right-hand corner of this page. What that's going to do is I highly recommend you click it. And what it really does is it puts you on Headway's follow network, which basically functions like your friend at the company. So it's going to tell the Headway hiring team that you are interested in them, even without filing an application or filling out anything else at all. That'll help put you on Headway's radar. The other thing it does, if let's say you check out those open roles in the tab there, and there's nothing really right now that like super suits you, or maybe you're not even really actively looking, you are just curious about what's out there. But clicking that follow button is definitely something I recommend because A, it'll put you on Headway's radar, but also it keeps you updated when they post new roles. So it's kind of like your friend at the company that's like, hey, they're looking for a software developer, or they're looking for somebody in their marketing department or whatever, and it lets you know, kind of keeps you up to date on what they've got going on, what their needs are, without you having to come back and keep checking job boards that seemingly never change until you miss a day checking, and then all of a sudden there's all these new jobs. So definitely take advantage of that tool we have on Power to Fly. You can follow and unfollow as many companies as you want, but obviously I recommend that you take a look at Headway. So definitely check out that link, and I'll share that link a couple more times during today's session. So one thing we're going to go over before we jump into the questions, the info you see on the screen in front of you is going to be a lot of the principal themes that we're going to try and touch on in today's talk. Now, we developed this list based on conversations with Kelsey, as well as based on the questions that y'all pre-submitted ahead of today's event. So when you registered, you had that option to submit a question. And what we've done is we've compiled all those questions. We've sort of, pulled out redundant ones and arranged it into what we feel is going to be a conversational format. So we're going to try and go over all the things on this list today. But if you are here and you're joining us live and you've taken time out of your day to spend with us, we want to make sure that that's time it's well worth it for you to be here. So if you are on today's call, we want to make sure that you get prime treatment. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please feel like you can drive today's conversation. You're more than welcome to come off mute and ask a question. You can put them in the chat thread, however you'd like to participate. But we definitely welcome that. And I want to make sure that even if you submitted a question prior to today's session, if you're not sure if we're going to ask it or if it's just something that you really want the answer to, coming off mute is the best way to get your question answered, second only to putting questions or comments into the Zoom group chat. And honestly, if we go over a question that you submitted and we're, maybe not reading the question right, or you want to add more context, please feel free to do that. I don't have a list in front of me of who submitted what question, but I'm happy to, take any and all context and extra info that you want to give us about that question so that you get an answer that's useful to you. So like I said, or like you'll see on the screen here, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can help develop a curiosity mindset within yourself. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can use empathy as a tool to help you solve problems. And then we're also going to touch on some of the best practices for scanning your company and identifying its challenges, which can be kind of difficult. So I'm really excited that we're going to go over this with Kelsey. All right, so the only other thing I have to say is that if you are going to come off mute and want to participate, that is great. Make sure that you are not interrupting Kelsey or one of our other attendees. You can interrupt me because I get paid to fill the silence, so that's totally fine. Just make sure you're not like interrupting when someone's speaking. Okay, so Kelsey, to get us started with one of the questions we were asked ahead of today's session, this person had wanted to know, how do you describe that curiosity mindset and how can we start to develop it?
Sure. So the way that I've been thinking about the curiosity mindset lately, both in doing this talk and trying new things outside of my comfort zone, is, I used to be somebody who was terrified of public speaking, as an example. And that's kind of I don't want to say it's a fear mindset, but it's maybe a self-preservation mindset. And so what I think is when you transition into this curiosity mindset, you transition out of self-preservation and into, what would that be like? Not, can I do this and not embarrass myself or say the wrong thing or anything like that, but thinking about what can I learn from this experience, or what can I learn from, the example of the public speaking. What can I learn from this experience? What can I learn from going on Power to Fly and chatting with Meg and all of the people in the Power to Fly network? Or what can I learn from, I'm a developer. What can I learn from the designer who's on the project? Or what can I learn from the subject matter expert who's worked for the company that I'm consulting for the last, 10 years? So that's kind of that's where the curiosity mindset comes from. There's different approaches to it, whether you're trying to, like we mentioned earlier, lean into empathy, like learn from an individual, or learn just the shape and characteristic of an organization or a new technology. I'm a developer, I have to learn new technologies all the time. Or the one that I think is maybe not as obvious is really digging into the industry that you find yourself in. As a consultant, I can find myself in myriad industries. If you work for just one company, you might think, oh, well, I just work for this bank, right? But we all know that finance has so many different aspects, not to mention everything going on right now, in the universe of finance, like cryptocurrency, all of that. So we know there's a lot there. So it's the willingness to dig in and then also let your shields down a little bit.
I love how you talk about, it's not necessarily a fear thing. It's also kind of a self-preservation thing. I remember one of the things my therapist told me really early on was that fear and excitement are actually chemically the same, like they come from the same place in your brain or in your, in your body. And that the only difference is whether you think it's going to go well or you think it's going to go badly. And so if you kind of, for me at least, it's really helpful to kind of notice that if I am feeling nervous, there's probably a reason for it, or I'm feeling anxious or worried about something. But like, if I kind of can step back a little bit and reframe what I think is going to happen, it makes it a lot easier to, come into something with a it makes it a lot easier to be curious, right? Because you're not worrying about protecting yourself the whole time. You are able to ask questions and really dig in. I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about them being kind of two sides of the same coin. It's like, am I anxious or am I excited? You can be both, but ultimately, I always think of like, what's the risk of doing something? Right now I could just, really bomb this talk, and that's a risk, but there's also a lot to gain in terms of meeting a lot of folks, already I'm meeting you, Meg, and I'm sure I'm going to get to meet lots of people that have joined the call today. So, you have to weigh those two things. It's not always going to be a yes, but it can help push you more into the yes column if you start to think about like, well, what is there to gain? What is there to learn?
Well, first off, I would never let you bomb, so don't worry about that. But yeah, like you're totally right. It's one of those things where if you're afraid, you don't have the bandwidth to be like curious about the whole situation. And for me, at least, especially when it's something I really don't want to do, but I know I have to. And especially when I've stepped back and thought about pros and cons, and there's some cons that you just can't avoid. It's going to like be hard to do something eventually in your life. It's one of those things that like kind of allows me to find value in the situation, even if I am somewhat miserable. At least I learned something and got something out of it that way. So I love that attitude shift. I love that. Okay, so when we're talking about this idea of being curious, how do we find that limit or the balance between being curious versus being a burden to other colleagues? And I think the way I heard this point, or the way I read this question, sounded like if you're constantly curious and asking questions, some people like have a really hard time doing that because either you feel like you're maybe not pulling your own weight, or you are telling people possibly incorrectly that you don't really know what you're doing. So if this was your question and you had a different version or a different like direction for it intended, please let us know. But Kelsey, did you read the question the same way, or did you have a different interpretation of it?
Yeah, I did read it the same way. And I would say diversify your sources, in terms of what you want to be, or where you're seeking to find the answers when, these questions arise in your, curious mind. I think it's right to be cognizant and courteous towards your colleagues. I think a big thing is do your research first. If you go to a colleague and just blurt out the first thing that comes to your mind and you haven't thought about it, or if it's something that you can Google or that kind of thing, I would say do that. Another thing you can do is to ask, if you really don't even know where to start, that's the question to ask. Where do I start with this? And then schedule some time later with the colleague. Say, I'm interested in, let's say, CSS animations. I've had colleagues reach out to me about that. They'll say, where do I start? And then I'll give them some resources, and then we schedule a follow-up call. Let's talk about what you learned, what's missing, what things have you confused, what things have you excited. And I think that is not just a technique to avoid, burdening your colleagues or annoying them or whatever, but it also is just going to be a more effective way to learn, because you can do a little, deep work research on your own, and then in the same way that you would in like a college course or something, you do your homework and then you show up and you have this great discussion between, your colleagues in a classroom. Same thing goes for the office. So I would just say that that's a big thing that you can do. That said, sometimes you really just don't know where to start. And so generally scheduling time, making sure that it's a good time for whoever you're reaching out to, and then showing that person over repeated engagements that you're taking what they have to say seriously, you're building on the knowledge that they've shared with you. And that kind of leads into, what we talked, I can't remember if it was one of the 3 points, but the idea of, as you start to follow this pattern, then you can start to anticipate maybe not necessarily what their answers are going to be, but like where their concerns lie. And when you're when that person that you're thinking of is in a leadership position, that puts you in a position to where you can be bringing a lot of value to your organization, because you're able to anticipate not only what does my manager, what does the CEO of my company think is important, that's what is important to the organization. If it's important to leadership, it's important to the organization, and you bringing value to the organization is ultimately what your job is, no matter what your job title is.
No, I absolutely love that. And I love what you said, because I feel like we do this a lot at Power to Fly, where it's like, okay, if you have a question, yeah, you can ask your team. And if they know of somebody, if they know something about it, or they know of somebody else that does in the group or in the org that you can talk to, we push them that way. But if there's no like SME about whatever question you asked, go out and Google it. And that's the thing is, like, I feel like it's one of those weird, like, open secrets that no one talks about, is how much people actually Google stuff at work to help them do their job. Like, my husband's an engineer.
100%.
He Googles stuff all the time. Like, I remember he told me something about being like eyeballs deep in some equation he was trying to work through. And his cubicle buddy was like, dude, why are you doing it the hard way? Like, go to this website. It's got all those stuff that you need to do. You can just plug it all in and it's done. So and I love the way you talked about, coming, like, scheduling that follow-up meeting and coming back to talk about not only like what's giving you problems, like what maybe you don't still understand about the subject or about the question, but also what you're excited about. I've never heard that before, and I absolutely love that. Finding out what somebody's excited about in something new that they're learning can really give you a lot of good insight into what maybe motivates them as an employee, or where they want to sort of take their career, or even just that project. So I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so this next question is going to pull us a little bit more into one of the other like, kind of subjects for today's conversation. This person had written in saying, how can we collaborate with empathy if we're not familiar with the whole workflow? Now, I read this to be maybe somebody that's new to a team, and doesn't understand maybe how they do things, like what that team culture is like, and they still want to come in from an empathetic mindset. Is this how you read it?
Yeah, I think so. And kind of what occurs to me in that is, if what you're trying to, like, let's say the process, they mentioned the process specifically, you're trying to learn this process. I think there is a tendency to think that maybe you're annoying people with basic questions, or there's this tendency to say, I'm sorry, I don't know this thing. But, and I know this isn't revolutionary advice by any means, but rather than saying you're sorry, say thank you. Like, I'm not saying you should never say sorry, but if it's a case of like, what you're doing is you're asking somebody to give some of their time to onboard you, get you up to speed, answer your question. Really, by saying thank you, you're saying, like, you're a generous you're empathizing with that person and saying, if I was in your position, I would recognize that I'm in a position of generosity, right, and giving. And so rather than saying sorry, like, I need to appease you because you may be mad or upset or something by me asking something, instead saying, thank you, I think really can pull you into that empathetic mindset, and then also positions you as collaborators with give and take. Like, one thing that we say and this will come later, I think we're going to talk about this, but like, one thing at Headway is, like, we all have much to learn, we all have much to teach. So even if you are new to the process, like, I know from experience, new team members bringing their own perspective to the table is so valuable, because it can be easy to get in a rut, or like, this is how we've always done it. And so having somebody new with a new perspective can really be super valuable. It's not a matter of just having to teach them your way and that being a burden.
Like, I completely agree. That idea, and you're right, it may not be revolutionary, but like, there's so many things people have said on these chats where it's like kind of a simple thing, but I've never heard it put that way, or somebody else might have never heard it, or might have not even heard the advice to begin with. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that's, it gets a lot into like the gendered culture of how we are socialized as kids, and how the working world tends to work right now, unfortunately. And hopefully we're going to try and keep working to change that. But yeah, women apologize, like, I feel like a lot more frequently than men do. And it becomes kind of like, it becomes second nature to either, like, say I'm sorry, or to add like, it's not framing language, what is it? Not pejorative, but like add in like, well, I'm just asking this, or, you know, I only need help with that, like qualifying language.
Yes.
And yeah, you're right that switching it from, you know, like, I'm sorry I'm late, to thank you so much for having patience with me. It's a total shift, right? It actually reminds me a lot of what they teach you to do, or you pick up doing in food service. Like, because I was a bartender and a waitress for like 6 years, and the idea of like saying thank you instead of I'm sorry, like, is really helpful in that environment, and it totally translates to the working world as well. I love that. And please don't forget, if y'all have a question, and if we're going over one of your questions and we either missed the mark or you have a follow-up, please feel free to ask it. It's definitely something we want to give y'all prime treatment, since you're here and spending time with us. Okay, so let's talk about some of the do's and don'ts about collaboration here. This person had asked for a framework that's specifically dealing with like cross-functional teams. But I mean, you could have collaboration even within the same team. So let's talk a little bit about some of those do's and don'ts are, and you know, you tell me if you think that the tasks or the order or whatever changes depending on the situation you're in.
Yeah, so yeah, do's and don'ts about collaborating. You know, beyond just being a courteous, you know, honest, kind person, let me think about what is. So here's something specific to Headway, and not just Headway, but something I know we really lean into at Headway is when that curiosity mindset, you know, grabs you and you learn a lot about a subject, then the onus is on you to then disseminate that knowledge throughout your organization. And for us, one of the best ways to do that is through blog posts. So then that's available throughout your organization. It's then available to the world, the internet. Also live streams like on our YouTube channel. You can also do this, you know, if you're somebody who, you know, you mentioned earlier, Meg, privacy is important to you. That's totally a legitimate thing. See if you can do something like a lunch and learn within your own organization. Because not only have you then, you know, taken the fruits of your labor and again added value to your organization by disseminating that information, you've also put yourself out there as somebody who is interested in learning and trying new things. You're interested in teaching other people, and what you might get out of that is, you know, new collaborators, right? Which I think is great, whether they're just your colleagues, your peers, whether they're, you know, getting the notice of people who are in leadership positions. I think there's a lot to gain there. In terms of don'ts, we already kind of talked about, you know, not neglecting to put your own investment in first before you ask another person to invest their time into getting your question answered. Another don't I would say is don't assume that everyone knows the answer to the question that you have in your mind. So in terms of like your subject matter domain, you might say to yourself, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why don't we just do it this way? And there might be a little voice in your head that's like, there's obviously a reason to not to do it that way, and you just don't know, and you're going to sound stupid if you say it. But really, I've had multiple times where either myself or somebody else says, well, why don't we do it this way? And then a light bulb goes off for everybody in the room. Like, why don't we? This happened to me recently. I was doing some front end development, and I was talking about there's this challenge between rotating this object and da 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 da. And this back end developer who was slated for me to train him said, well, what if instead of rotating it, you just started it at a different position? And I was like, wow, like that is a great approach. Like, I didn't think about that. I was so in my own like ingrained, you know, I do this day to day. Like I said, it can get easy to get stuck in a rut. I think people undervalue what their contributions could be, especially if they're not an expert in that. Like I said, he was back end. I was talking about a front end issue. He just happened to be in the meeting. So we talked earlier about put the investment time in, but sometimes, those wanderings, like I wonder if, can really bring a lot of value.
No, I absolutely agree. I think you're right. It's one of those things where if you recognize that great ideas can come from anywhere, and the person who's in the room has, they're not just one of those people that kind of comes off half-cocked, says things just to say them, whatever. Yeah, it's definitely important to remember that if you open it up and you have more than one person like putting their heads together on whatever the problem is, you're far more likely to find a solution. And there's a lot of things that, especially at Power to Fly, that we've tried because somebody suggested like, hey, let's do it. And honestly, for as many of them that haven't worked out, there's been plenty more that have. And even the ones that didn't work out taught us something, right? I remember hearing very early on when I started hosting these chats, one person had said something about, successful people are not people that do everything right the first time. Successful people are the ones that learn from failure. Because if you're not failing, you're not learning anything new, which means you're not growing. So the idea was, don't be afraid to fail and don't be afraid to try something different or try something new, because that's how you keep growing and that's how you get into being, a subject matter expert or the go-to person on your team that they ask when something comes up. So I think that's an amazing point to make. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I also wanted to just throw one more thing out there.
Yeah.
A really important do that I think people overlook or skim past is when you're having like sessions where you're actively collaborating as a team, take the time to set a foundation, like let's all put our assumptions out on the table, because sometimes you have different ideas of what you're trying to do. And only halfway through the meeting have you actually clarified what is it that we're trying to achieve. Like the requirement in my head might be different from the requirement in your head, and taking the time to say, here's all the assumptions, here's all the constraints, here's any history or context that I have that other people don't have, giving people an opportunity to share that is really setting you up for success when you're collaborating.
I think that's a really great flag, because you're right. There could be a lot of different like objectives being kind of juggled around, and you may or may not know that. But then I've also been in meetings where people were kind of trying to piggyback off something that you were doing. And so even though their personal objective is not on anybody else's mind, nobody knows what they're doing. And it really is just, it doesn't have anything to do with like derailing what you're doing, but they're just hoping to kind of like build on whatever you're making. There can be suggestions made that would directly undermine what you're trying to do, and they don't understand that because their focus is their focus. So yeah, I think starting with that baseline of like, okay, here's what we're here to do. We've tried, super high level, like we've tried this, and this. Does anybody have any ideas? Blah, blah, blah. Like that's just, great best practice. Thank you for that.
Well, and to your point, Meg, like it's also totally, I think, appropriate to say when you're having these sessions and you've laid out like this is the objective, when people start to take steps outside of the scope of what the call is supposed to be about, schedule a follow-up call. Say, actually right now we're talking about, design, but you raised some great points about DevOps considerations. Let's take it as an action item that at the end of the meeting, we're going to schedule a meeting to talk about DevOps, right? That's just an example. So yeah, I think that's really important too, is because it doesn't serve anybody to, everybody has their own idea of what we're talking about. It's better to just kind of narrow your scope. That way you can really get to those answers.
Yeah. All right. So Cindy's in the chat saying transparency is key. I totally second that. It's one of those things people tend to forget sometimes, is that we're all on the same team. We're all trying to work towards the same goals. Other people have like maybe additional goals or like, motivations that are within those, but it's definitely important to remember, like you're all working towards the same thing. It'll go a lot faster if you go together than if you try to kind of too many cooks in the kitchen or try and lead things in separate directions. Yeah. And I love the follow-up idea. That would be a really great way to kind of keep the meeting on track without making people feel like either they're not being heard or you're not concerned or that's not important to you as a, personally or whatever. So yeah, I love that idea. All right, this person wrote in saying, next week I'm starting off in a new company. I'm still going to work in finance, but now, apologies if I have this wrong, in an agronomy company, sorry, an industry from which I don't know much about. How would you suggest learning more about it? Okay, so if you're pivoting to a new industry, even if you are familiar with like your department, let's say, or like, you're still staying within finance, but the industry you're entering is completely different. How would you suggest going about kind of getting up to speed?
Yeah, so at a previous company, I used to, it was whiplash, all the different like industries I would jump into. And a great resource are looking for case studies and or white papers, both case studies that have been written about, maybe the organization that you're going to go work for or similar organizations, white papers that have been written by the organization you're going to work for or other similar organizations. It really gives you a sense of, like, a case study specifically gives you a sense of what has been a important initiative that this company has had before that they achieved, and how did they go about doing it. And a lot of times too, it'll say, here were things that didn't work. I think those are really underutilized sources. In addition to that, I would just try to connect with colleagues as you can, especially colleagues that are not people that you're going to be interacting with every day, because there will be lots of opportunities over, stand-ups or code reviews or whatever is equivalent in your industry. But, I'm a developer. If I go and partner with a product owner, or like, asked to have coffee with a product owner who is working on a completely different project than me, I can see, what problem are they tackling, and what have they tried, and who's involved in that, and who's, like, we talk about cross teams and stuff, who works on both teams, what are they learning from that. I think that's another great resource that you can tap.
I love that. I've done something similar in the past where when I was moving to a completely brand new industry, I talked to the human resources manager. So when I got that, like, here's what your start date's going to be, here's this, here's that. I've done it actually two different ways. In one company, which was larger, I asked if, what they would recommend to kind of bring me up to speed on the company. If there's like specific resources, let's say they've done, let's say they've done like maybe an interview with one of the top partners was in a magazine a couple of weeks ago, or somebody else has a blog post about it or whatever. The other thing I've done before is asked in HR if there's anybody else that's been with the company for, a couple of years or whatever, who has also pivoted, like came from a different field. And then I get in touch with that person and I'm like, okay, hey, like especially more helpful when it's not somebody you're actually working in close contact with, because that way you can get that kind of more objective idea of like, well, this is what, what helped me to, kind of get up to speed, or this is, these are some of the resources I did, or don't make this mistake because this means something completely different, that idea. Because you're right. I mean, like similarly, I went from paralegal to purchasing to construction to audiobooks. Like I've worked all over. So yeah, definitely a good idea. And actually Astrid is in the chat here saying that annual reports are a good resource too. So I do love that idea as well.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Okay. So this person, there's kind of a follow-up to this. This person said, when you're starting in a new company, what is kind of the basic information we should know to make sure that we're consistently working towards that ultimate goal? So for me, this was less about the industry, or it was less about the industry as a whole, and it was more to, at least in my mind, the question seemed to be more about, like the specific goals of your department or the specific goals of your company at large. Is this how you read it as well?
Yeah, and so the only way to know what are the goals of your department or your organization are to ask. And in my experience, the best way to sort of keep a pulse on what's going on in the company and what's important to the company are through one-on-ones with your manager. I personally, in a Headway, we do weekly one-on-ones. We schedule, I think, between 15 and 30 minutes. And it's just an opportunity to talk about how things are going on your project, your own personal goals, how things are going at the company. Don't neglect to come prepared to that with questions about, again, how can I bring value to the company? Because there may be an opportunity that you're not going to know about unless you ask, or there may be an objective that you're not going to know about unless you ask. So, I all the time I come to my one-on-one with questions like, there's this opportunity, I could take it or leave it. I'm not personally like on fire about it. Sometimes I am personally on fire about things, and I let my boss know that too. But there may be times where I say, I'm not personally on fire with it, but would this, bring value to the company? And sometimes the takeaway is, well, let me talk to leadership and I'll get back to you. Or, hey, I'm coming up with my quarterly goals. Where can I focus or start to think about some goals? Like what, is it architecture? That's something that would be in my field. Is it documentation? Is it training my colleagues? Is it being trained? Is there a gap in my knowledge that I need to fill? I really think one-on-ones are so valuable, and definitely take advantage of them if they're there. Come prepared, have some notes. If they're not, talk to your manager about how you can start something like that for yourself. Even if it's not a weekly thing, it's just regular check-ins to make sure that you're headed in the right direction. Because you can work super, super hard, but if you're working on something that's not important to people, that's really going to be a big bummer for you when you figure that out.
Absolutely. Nobody wants to work crazy hard on a project just to realize A, it's not super helpful to anybody else, and B, there's not a lot of like appreciation for the time you spent on it. That can be really, really demoralizing in my experience.
Yeah, and sometimes the like personal projects, or not personal projects, but smaller projects that you can work on, it's like your supervisor might affirm something that you don't even realize is a talent or a special ability that you have, right? Like you might be really good at, like, let's say in this agroeconomy one, like maybe all your colleagues know a lot about wheat and plants and stuff, but you really understand like animal husbandry. Like, and your boss will say, I want you to write up everything you know and do a lunch and learn, and that would bring a ton of value to the company. You might not even realize that you specifically have this special like knowledge. So there are opportunities there, I think, in every industry.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so when you talked about like kind of anticipating some of the company's needs and trying to see where some of your strengths might help benefit the rest of the group, especially ones that maybe aren't exactly within your, your job description or within your department's like purview. When you're trying to think outside of that, what are some of the best ways to anticipate what your clients' needs might be when you're developing product or writing code or whatever you might be doing at a specific company? How do you really anticipate what the client is going to need?
So kind of a metaphor here is like this idea of machine learning. Like our brains are a lot like machine learning in that, or maybe I should say machine learning is a lot like our brains, in that you have to start out with a data set before you can start making predictions. Like with these machine learning algorithms, they feed them all this data, and it's like data and it's labeled. So you think of these image processing ones where it's like, this is a picture of a cat, this is a picture of this, da 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 da. And the algorithm or the machine learning engine or whatever has to be trained on all of this before it can start making the predictions itself. And those predictions are really good, and they get really good after you have a lot of data. So in terms of being able to predict what is going to bring value to your client, you have to first start by examining what is bringing value to them now, both on the project that you are working on and outside of the project that you're working on. And also, you need to be asking questions to that end. So if there's an initiative to integrate a third-party application into the application you're developing for them, what value does it bring you? And they might say, oh, well, actually, we want to integrate Jira because a lot of our customers are software developers, and so they use Jira. later down the line, when they say, what should our next initiatives be? You might say, well, you mentioned before that software developers are a big piece of it. So why don't we look at integrating GitHub or Bitbucket or, specific to them? So it's just a matter of like collecting the data, both passively and more directly, and then using that data to then make predictions, and also coming with your ideas with the context of why you think it would be a good idea. I think also it just shows that you're observant and a good listener and somebody that they probably want to have at the table, because you not only ingest the information, but then you digest it and are willing to share your take.
Yeah, I think that's great. Okay, so along those same lines, as we're like, trying to like scan or keep tabs on things that, people drop in conversation or additional info that you get in the course of a project, how can you do that with someone who's a lot closer to you, like, like a manager as opposed to an external partner? This person had written in saying, I'd love to be able to anticipate my manager's needs and requests, but I'm not sure how to use curiosity or empathy to do that with them. So let's kind of approach it from this angle.
Yeah, I think the first piece is to have that open line of communication through one-on-ones or any other kind of status updates. And I think, anticipating needs isn't always going to be 100%. But I think if you come to your manager and say, in the past you've expressed this, and this are important. Here's another couple other pieces of information you might not be aware of. And taking all of that into account, I think we should try X. They might say, not X, but Y. And thanks for like bringing all this information to me. So I think that's a way to do it. I don't think you're ever going to get to the point where you're going to be able to read people's minds by any means, but I think it's a power of, I always get these mixed up, deduction, induction, just using the data to come up with your answers. And there has to be a level of trust there, and hopefully you have that with your manager. Another thing that we do at Headway is we've on several occasions used different resources from Brene Brown, and about like, how can we communicate with each other? How can we rumble? How can we keep those lines of communication open and really get to the truth of the matter? Because we all know we can tell ourselves stories, whether they're emotional or just, oh, well, this thing isn't important to the company, like jumping to those conclusions. So
no, I totally agree. Like that's like Cindy said earlier, that's kind of where that transparency is key, and just letting someone know, like, hey, I'm trying to be able to anticipate what you're going to need and be a little more proactive here. What, even just starting there can give you a lot of brownie points. Even if, like you said, nobody's going to become a mind reader. If that were possible, there'd be a world full of Miss Cleos, because people would figure out how to do it. So I think that's a really good pointer. Okay, so can you talk about maybe some experiences that you've had when you had to implement, use these skills to try and implement an innovative solution? What was a time that you've had to, kind of practice what you're talking about today?
Sure. So I definitely have had times when I've got, here's an example. I have a great supervisor. He's very affirming of, skills and talents that I have. And it kept happening over and over that people would have one-off questions, and I would be able to answer them in technologies that I was specialized in. And so then identifying the opportunity to do intentional training, not just one-off like interactions with people when they have a very specific question. Hey, I got stuck on this one line of code. Can you help me fix it? And so through that, I was able to start to do lunch and learns with my client that I was working for, because I had been affirmed, one, by my supervisor that I knew what I was talking about in these technologies, and also I identified that there was a need. Folks were asking me for help to get unstuck, and third, I had built up trust and a great working relationship with the people I was working for at that company that I was consulting for, and so it ended up being super successful, being able to do dedicate time to do one-on-one pairings with people and train them, but then also do like larger group meetings to introduce people to technologies they might not be aware of, and just things like that. It's sort of looking at a 360 view of the organization and recognizing like there's something I can bring to the table here, or that somebody can. If it's not you, somebody else. But that said, if it's somebody else, don't you can suggest it, you can't command them necessarily.
No, I think that's a really good point. And actually, strictly from a personal point of curiosity, I've done stuff like this similarly, and obviously in a different industry, a little slightly different setting. But I've had times, especially when I was new at a company, where I didn't have that rapport built up. If you get shot down when, like, the first time you suggest something like this, is that something to keep in mind the next time you try and propose this type of, like either, like a lunch and learn situation or information sharing or dedicated training for something? Is that something you should keep in mind the next time, or is it best to sort of turn on your goldfish brain and just say, okay, we're going to try this again?
I think if you bring an idea to the table or anticipate a need that ends up being not a need, figuring out why that is. Is it a case of, not yet? Is it a case of, we don't think that would bring a value, but maybe this other thing would? Just kind of digging a little bit under the surface. I think it can be easy, myself included, to have somebody say, no, and then kind of have your ego bruised a little bit through that. And this is all assuming that they're saying no in a respectful, courteous way. But if you can dig into, okay, why not? Then again, that's another piece of data that just makes your next prediction that much more valuable, especially if it's something as simple as we're just really bogged down in trying to launch this, product that we're launching right now, but maybe in the summer, maybe next quarter. That's a really easy hump to get over. And then if it's the kind of thing where like your prediction was off in terms of what would bring value, if you can get the answer of like, my answer was wrong, but what would be the right answer, then that's such a valuable opportunity, because somebody's handed you on a silver platter, here's how you can, have yourself stand out or bring value to the company.
No, and I absolutely love that, because say, even if your first pitch of, this, first attempt at this isn't really something you're super passionate about, but you think it's, a direction that could be taken, I think that's a really great, especially if it's something you really want to do, it's a really great idea to have to like follow up with like, hey, when there's more time, could we still approach this? If so, when do you think would be a great time? That way you can put like a reminder in your calendar or set up a meeting with this person well in advance and say, hey, here's when we'll circle back to what we talked about 3 months ago or whatever. I love that. All right, so one last question we're going to ask before we start to wrap things up today, because this time always goes very quickly. Let's talk a little bit about how a lot of what we're talking about kind of requires a certain amount of confidence, as well as kind of comfortability, like going out on a limb. Is there a way to pursue this, kind of being a curious person and trying to be collaborative while being very terribly shy? Because I feel like this happens to a lot of people. And even if you're not really shy, being like the anxiety aspect of this can have a lot of the same outcomes or the same results. So how would you tell somebody with either anxiety, shyness, these kinds of issues, how would you tell them to proceed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a hard one. And to give some of my background, I've worked for Headway for 2 years. Before I worked for Headway, I worked part of a very small firm of like 10 economists, and I was the only developer. And when I came to Headway, I knew this was going to be a huge culture shift for me, being, going from being one person working alone to working as part of a team, having people review my code, review my assumptions. It was a painful transition, not because of Headway, but just change is painful, right? Especially none of us, I think I think there's this fear that you're going to be like exposed as like you didn't know. I think part of it is building up relationships, seeing your colleagues and your bosses and your clients as human, and then also taking baby steps. So if you're trying to start to use your voice, if you have a supervisor that you really trust and you've built up a relationship with, take the idea to them first and say, here's what I've noticed, here's the research I've done, here's an idea I have. What do you think? And a good supervisor, if they will give you, first of all, honest feedback, and they might say, yeah, I think you should run with it, or let me get some more information for you, either from, leadership or somebody else who has a special knowledge here. So start small, baby steps. Also, I would say start taking steps out of your comfort zone in ways that you feel are manageable. Maybe don't, for your first public speaking, go on live, YouTube live and talk to who knows how many people, but maybe see, can I do a lunch and learn for the department? Or even if you just have some friends at the company, just say, I'm really nervous about this. Can we meet for lunch? And I'm going to give a quick run through of what I would talk about and get their feedback. So start small, build it up a little bit at a time. And for me, it's coming onto this call, I was public speaking still makes me nervous, right? It's just a matter of I always, after having a few wins under my belt, I know that I can say I know it's going to feel good at the end, and you get the reward of being I was scared, but I did it anyway. There's, for me, not to psychologize it too much, but that really helps me too.
No, I absolutely love that. And we've got Cindy chiming in the chat that Toastmasters is another opportunity to brush up on stuff like public speaking. So thank you, Cindy, for sharing that resource. Okay, thank you so much. That was really, and not to over psychologize it at all, but it's such a, it's such a personal thing for a lot of people that it can be really hard to get yourself out of that mindset. Okay, so to close us out and kind of round out today's session, let's talk a little bit about Headway. So these are some questions that we reached out to Kelsey to go over prior to today's session. You described the company culture as generative. Can you tell us, kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and this was hard to go down to one word. So let me tell you, I was on thesaurus.com trying to find something that I felt like fit. These first two kind of go together in that for Headway, it's a place where when you join the organization, we recognize that you are a whole person with both your skills that you have around the job you do, but you have a family, you have, maybe your education is varied. And so we then know that we have something to learn from you. We also know we have things that we can share, our perspectives as whole people, as an organization, what has worked for us. And so when I think about Headway, I just think about the opportunities for growth, both as an individual and as part of a team. Opportunities to collaborate across disciplines. So, I often collaborate with our marketing team, collaborating with designers and product as well. And a big piece that plays into this is the idea that we have investment time. So we do 35 billable hours, and then we have 5 hours of investment time. So some of that's used up in internal meetings and some tasks and things like that. But A lot of it, the lion's share, I think, goes toward, you know, upskilling and learning new things to make you more effective and getting to, again, satisfy that curiosity mindset.
That's so great. I love that. And you're not the first person to say that, like, trying to boil it down to one question or one like adjective is really hard. It is really difficult to describe a company culture in one sentence. Even if it's not a culture you particularly like or like that works for you, it's still really hard. All right. So you talked about, kind of working at Headway and how everybody has something to teach and everybody has something to learn. And I absolutely love that. Let's talk a little bit about your top tips for someone who's interviewing.
Yeah, so I feel like this talk has been very illustrative of this tip because, Meg, I'm your guest, right? And you're interviewing me, but you're not drilling me with questions, and I'm also not expected to just talk for an hour straight. And so if if I'm doing a interview with you, it really helps if you come with questions prepared, even just, simple things like what does your typical day look like, that kind of thing, because I want it to be conversational. But I don't know what you're wondering about. I know what I'm wondering about you. But what are you curious about the organization? Are you curious about our clients, our processes, our culture? We're ready to answer those questions, and then so it turns it from being one directional to being two directional in that conversation. And I think it makes it a better experience for everybody all around. I hope it takes some stress off too, because if you have a good question to ask and that you can let the person who's interviewing you take some time to answer, that gives you a breather, and you don't have to, you can just recalibrate. I know how hard it can be to have to talk for long lengths of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great idea. I mean, that's something that I was always, and granted, I'm kind of long in the tooth. I've been into the working world for quite a while now, but like, it's definitely one of the things that I was always taught growing up and in classes and even from experience. Especially if they ask, if the person interviewing you says like, do you have any questions for me? You never say no, ever. Even if it's, even if like during all your research about the company, you kind of know everything. I always keep 4 questions in my back pocket, which sounds like a lot, but like I usually take in notes like, hey, do you mind if I take notes while we conduct this interview, blah, blah, blah. But I always come in with 4 questions, 2 that are a little bit more fun, like, what's your company culture like? What's the reason people stay here? That kind of thing. And then I try and come in with 2 that are either something that's like related to like the department or the job that I'm looking to fill, or related to their industry on like a large scale. So, what's some of the fun things that you schedule for your employees? What are some of the, the highlights of your year, that kind of thing. And even if you don't ask the questions, fine. I am also not above asking a question that I already know the answer to because I've done my research. Anything to show that like you do still have more interest in this company. Well, it never hurts to show how interested you are in a company. In my experience, companies that are, turned off by the thirst are probably not companies you want to work for anyway. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so in our last couple seconds, I am going to highlight obviously some of the open jobs at Headway currently. I put that link into the chat to where you can check out Headway's company page on powertofly.com. Kelsey, I just want to say a huge thank you to you. This has been a wonderful afternoon. I really enjoyed getting to talk with you and learn from you about how we can kind of better collaborate in our working lives. Just thank you so much. It was lovely.
Thank you, Meg. I really enjoyed it. And thanks all the Power to Fly folks who made this possible. I know I've been in communication with several people, so I was really excited to get to culminate with this great talk with you.
Good, awesome. Thank you so much. And then obviously I want to say a huge thank you to our amazing participants. Y'all had some great questions ahead of today's event and plenty during, so that was really awesome. I do want to highlight, obviously we are having our June mini summit next week. We're focusing on Pride at work because it is Pride Month. So we will be celebrating the LGBTQ plus community and finding ways to better connect with and help uplift the alphabet mafia and really welcome and take advantage of this great segment of people within the working world that really need to be better appreciated. So please join us for that. It's next week, June 8th through the 11th. It's totally free to join. Check out the link that I just posted. That's where you can go to get your free ticket. And I hope to see you there. For anybody who is maybe new to these Power to Fly chats, thank you so much for joining us. I hopefully will see you on many more chats in the future. And if not, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you all have a happy rest of your Wednesday and a good week ahead. And I can't wait to see y'all get back here soon. Bye.